Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the library. My name is Irene, and I'm going to be one of the presenters tonight. I'm here with my colleague Carla, who's also monitoring the chat. So, tonight we're going to talk about how we take a food business idea all the way through development and into a real live business. So we've called this Considerations for Aspiring Food Entrepreneurs because the reality is that entrepreneurship is not necessarily right for everyone. So we want to give a realistic look at what it takes to create a food business, and we'll be drawing on our own experience as well as that of our clients. Our firm is called PrepShift, and we provide consulting and coaching to different food service businesses and restaurants all over the country, with a concentration here in Boston. And our goal really is to help restaurants start sustainably and be able to take great care of their teams and build sustainable businesses. We are super grateful to be hosted by Kirstein Business Library and our dear friend Nikki, and to be here in the beautiful Boston Public Library. And just a couple words about our team. So again, my name is Irene. I'm the CEO here at PrepShift. We also have a colleague named Dylan, who's kind of the numbers guy. You can't tell, but he usually wears a Patagonia, so that's how you know. And then Carla is here as well, our COO. And yeah, like I said, we're really excited to have you here to talk about some of the common pitfalls and risks of entrepreneurship and also all the different steps that it takes to get you to the point of actually having your own food business. So, I want to start by sharing a little bit with all of you about my own food entrepreneurship journey. There are a lot of people who talk about food businesses and have never actually run one. So, I am here to hopefully give you a little bit of that first person context. So, I created a business with my older brother and sister called Mei Mei back in 2012. Mei Mei means little sister in Mandarin. And my brother had this idea to open a food truck. And I was like, no way you can do that without my help. You better name the business after me. So he and his two little Mei-Meis, we were very bossy. We got involved, of course. And in 2012, our food truck hit the road. And I will tell you straight up that we were running on optimism and enthusiasm, and we had no plan. But we thought, oh my gosh, food trucks look like so much fun. We watch them on the Food Network. They get to serve all these people on the street. Wouldn't that be great for us to jump in with both feet? And so that's what we did. Fast forward about 13 years later, we opened a restaurant, we took on catering, we had a shipping container that served food, and we now have a South Boston location where we produce 40,000 dumplings every week. And we have really expanded the business. So, the reason I'm kind of sharing the starting point and the ending point is that there's a lot of stuff that happened in the middle that not everybody knows about. So we explored tons of different aspects of having a food business over the years. And I liken this to entrepreneurial joyriding, meaning you get in the car, you don't know where you're going, you got a full tank of gas, and you're just going to explore. So we went through lots of different iterations of our business, and eventually we got to the point where we had this factory in South Boston. One of the things I want to note is that if you are just joyriding, that has costs over time. So we had multiple ownership structures. Like I bought my siblings out and then I brought on new partners. We also had to reorganize the way our corporations were structured legally at the state. We had a lot of people join the company and then leave because maybe they didn't get into what they thought they were getting into. And one other thing that I think is important is that many food businesses can't actually afford to pay the owner, even if that person is working 40, 60, 80 hours a week. And in our work and our research with over 100 different food businesses, we find that low or no compensation for the owner is unfortunately very common. So we want to make sure that you have some insight into this before you make a big decision about your potential business. So our goals for today are to give you kind of a high-level roadmap of the process of starting a food business. What are all the things you need to think about and keep in mind? And maybe, we can introduce some concepts that you weren't familiar with before. We want to help you avoid some of the common mistakes that we've made or that we've seen clients make, or maybe both. And then finally, make sure that when you set yourself up, you have a pathway to sustainable success, whatever that means to you. So, our agenda for today, we're going to start with talking about business identity. Why are you getting into this? And then, what are the foundations for creating your business? We are also going to do what we call a financial reality check. And then we'll talk about some of the steps to actually get started. As we're here today, please feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, ask questions. Folks who are on Zoom, if you have a question that you want to put in the chat, Carla or Nikki will put their hand up and let me know that you have a question. So, does that all sound okay for us to jump in? All right, great. I'm curious. Who here is thinking about starting a food business? Probably a few people, at least. Okay, and you can raise your hand like that. It's okay. And then, does anyone here currently work in a food business? Okay, great. A couple people. All right. So we all have different kind of experiences coming into this. And we certainly know that many people are talented home cooks, home bakers, and you probably hear all the time, this thing you made is so good. You should start a business. So that's what we're here to talk about. So, of course, the food industry has a certain appeal to it. Across all these independents and chains, it generates over $800 billion in revenue every year. And independent food businesses, meaning not a big corporation, not a franchise, independents make up 70% of all food service businesses. So this is an industry where you can get a foothold with a single location and a small team. And of course, probably no matter whether you work in a food business or thinking about starting one, you love to eat, just like me. So there is some appeal to offering a unique customer experience, something that people are going to talk about, that they're going to remember, that they're going to tell their friends about. All of that is part of the fun of cooking for people and providing a dining experience, right? And so we want to make sure that we know that the numbers in our industry, when we think about individual businesses, they sort of tell a different story. So you've probably heard a lot of different statistics. These are the ones that we believe to be most accurate. A lot of restaurants fail in their first year, pretty early on. And many that don't fail in their first year go on to fail in the first 5 years. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. But even the restaurants that do stay open often generate profit of about 3 to 5%. And if you've worked in another industry where profit is much greater than that, you might be asking yourself, why would I ever start a food business? It's because you are going to have to really love what you do. And also, you're going to have to really carefully control for those margins. So, another way of thinking about this is every time you bring in a dollar, after you've paid all your bills, you have a nickel left over. So that's what we see, especially for independent restaurants. Finally, it can take years to become profitable. And as I mentioned before, food business owners are often underpaid or not paid at all. And so, depending on your personal situation, that may or may not be a sensible risk for you to take. And so, we want to make sure that we're able to communicate about this and be really open about it. So, our question is basically, how do we increase the potential for our business to actually generate profit for us? One thing we're talking about today is just being careful about letting your passion bring you into starting a business. Many people here, probably you hear it all the time. You're a great cook, you're a great baker, you should start your own business. Just because you are an amazing cook does not necessarily mean that you are going to love running a business. When we first started the food truck, I thought that my life was just going to be, going to the farmer's market, buying beautiful ingredients, cooking food, feeding happy people. I had no idea that 90% of my time would be taken up by things other than that, where I hired people to do the work that I really liked to do. And so we would say that, if what you love about cooking as a hobby is the actual cooking, it may or may not make sense for you to turn that into a business where you may not get much time to cook at all. And there are a couple common pitfalls around, thinking about the profitability of a business. The first one that we talk about and hear about all the time is not really knowing how much it costs to produce food. So you might say to yourself, I can make this, delicious sandwich at home for $3. If I charge my customer $8, I'll have $5 of profit. The reality is, in most food businesses, you have to pay a lot of bills other than just those ingredients, right? Can anyone think of something else you have to pay for? Labor. Yep. What else? A permit. Great. Anything else? Utilities. Yeah. What else? Insurance, taxes. Great. Okay. The thing is, we could stand here all night and talk about the expenses. The list goes on and on. So, suffice to say, there are a lot of things that eat up that $5 of gross profit and can leave you with very little at the end of the day. Another thing that we run into is that sometimes we overestimate the demand for our product. Everybody at the potluck loved my dish. And I'm sure they did. And there's a difference between having paying customers who are willing to pay what it costs for you to produce that food and having friends and family who are just really supportive and are glad that you brought a dish to the potluck. So we want to try to be a little bit objective in terms of how we think about how much could I actually sell? What could I actually charge? And I want to rely on my target customer, but my target customer can't just be the people who already know and like me. Or that's a very small business. And then finally, we know a lot of people, such as myself, who said, I don't know, this seems fun. I'm sure I'll just figure it out. The reality in that case is that there are a lot of pieces of running a food business that you cannot ignore and that you can get in trouble for ignoring, right? Some of you have already listed some of them. Having permits, having insurance, following all the rules involved. And another reality is that starting up a food business can be really expensive. We're going to talk about ways to do it without spending as much capital up front. But there are businesses that run out of cash before they ever get to open their doors and serve a single customer. So again, we want to be really careful about how we plan around that. Any questions before I keep going? Are you scared? Okay, yeah, there's a little element of that. But we're going to talk more about brass tacks. So in our experience, there are some key areas that predict success for food businesses. And again, we drew this from in-depth interviews with more than 100 restaurants. And so we want to share some of those insights with you. So the first thing we sort of talked about this mirrors the prior slide. Having a clear understanding of what your costs are and what profit margin you can expect to generate is super important. This is going to allow you to plan not just what am I selling today, but in the long term, how long will it take me to generate a profit, to be able to pay myself, to be able to pay back my loan or my debt. Market validation with paying customers, meaning have you gone outside of your friends and family group to see what people are actually willing to pay for your product? The next one, systems and processes that work without you. This is a tough one because a lot of times we envision ourselves being hands-on in our business forever. But you're going to want to go on vacation. Maybe you win the lottery. Who's going to know how to do all the things that only you know how to do? If anyone's watched The Bear, I think they demonstrate this pretty effectively. That if one person is the holder of all the knowledge, you don't have a restaurant. You just have a job for yourself that you have to go and do every day. And then finally, legal structure and compliance from day one. It can feel really fun to just jump right in and start selling food. We know a lot of startups, they start selling plates out of their kitchen at home. Maybe they do a pop-up here or there. But there are a lot of risks to getting too far ahead of yourself. And there are ways that can come back to bite you in the butt later. So some things that we recommend that we see with successful food entrepreneurs, I think the most important one is they test in little bits and pieces before they start something big. So for example, starting with a food truck before you open a restaurant, having a pop-up before you sign a lease. These are all ways to kind of get your product out there and also to experience doing the work. Like, do you actually like making that many croissants, or is it only fun if you're making, 20 or 40? We try to really encourage people to focus on one thing and do it really well. There are probably a lot of restaurants that you've been to, I know I've been to them, where they have huge menus. And even though it might be nice to feel like you have a lot of options, it also creates a sense of like, do these people really know what they're doing if they have all this different food on the menu? So having a degree of focus, especially for today's consumer, millennials, Gen Z, Gen A, we think that that is really important because they want to know exactly what they're getting when they come to visit you at your food business. And then finally, planning for both best case and worst case scenarios. We all know that we hope that we're going to do amazing numbers and that all of our suspicions about how great our product is will turn out to be true. But there are a lot of things out of our control. For example, we work with many restaurants who opened or expanded right in the middle of COVID. So knowing how you're going to plan for those worst case scenarios is really important as well. All right, any questions? We're going to keep on rolling. Okay, great. So, talking a little bit about your business identity and some of the foundational pieces. And sorry, before I keep going, I do want to note we are going to cover a ton of content tonight. And if the only thing you remember when you walk out of here is like, wow, that was a lot of stuff, that's great. Like, that's totally fine with me. The goal here is to kind of demonstrate some of the things you may not know or you may not have thought about. We are recording, I think. And so this will be accessible to you if you need it in the future. We also are available if anyone wants to chat at a separate time or after tonight. So you can take pictures, do whatever you want to do. But if you're like, oh my God, this is so overwhelming, that's kind of why you're here. So thank you for that. All right. So talking about your business identity and foundations, the first thing we really want to ask ourselves is the vision. Why are you doing this? You may already have a great job doing something that pays you well, and you don't have to worry about the profitability of the company. So, whatever would inspire you to take on a big risk for yourself? So, we think about the vision in three kind of separate pieces. The first is what are you actually doing? What are you making and selling? The second is how do you do it? And how does that set you apart from other people? And the third is why. Why do you do it and why does it matter to you? And when we talk about food businesses, the what is usually the same. We make food so that people can eat it, right? Most food businesses have the exact same what. And maybe there are little variations, different cuisines, different meal services. But we really want to emphasize that it's the why and the how that makes us special and memorable. And that's really what builds loyalty to our brand. And we will tell you all many times over, loyal customers, repeat customers, regular customers, that is the backbone of any business. And so, thinking even about this neighborhood here in Back Bay, if you want a cup of coffee, there's a dozen places, probably more, that you could go. But what would you choose and why? That's the question that we want you to be able to answer about your own future business. What's going to make someone choose you, even though they might be able to get a very similar product somewhere else? So these are just a couple examples of the whys that drive some of these, pretty well-known brands. Hopefully you can see from back there. So for example, we have Apple, and the why as articulated here is to challenge the status quo and to think differently. If you didn't know that was Apple, they could be selling anything, right? But they've directed that vision towards selling electronics. Of course, we also have Microsoft, which makes a lot of similar products to what Apple makes, right? But we see Microsoft's vision as empowering every person and organization to achieve more. So basically, what we're hoping to demonstrate is that when you hold up the why against the what, there may not be a direct connection, but the why is what makes your what more appealing to your target customer. So a lot of what we talk about with our clients is storytelling. How do we tell a story that really directs us to the customer who's going to get the most out of supporting our business? A lot of businesses want to serve everybody. And of course, you do want to be inclusive. But most really successful brands do not sell to everyone. They know who their target audience is. Is anyone here a Starbucks drinker? Okay. Is anyone here a Dunky? A Dunky? Okay, one. So think about that example. They both sell coffee, right? And when you get down to it, coffee is more or less the same two ingredients, although there are a lot of hows that you can alter. So, really, knowing your audience and knowing how to reach them, how to message to them, that depends on what your vision is for your brand. So, when we're thinking about identifying your audience, there are a couple different ways that you can do research and start getting out there and using the lens and the point of view of a business owner. So, you might ask yourself, what are similar businesses in the area? What are their menus and pricing? Who are their customers? Who's attracted to that business and why? Is it just the quality of the food? Is it the personalities of the baristas? Is it the decor? Is it the music? Like all of these are little pieces of what makes a brand unique. And then a really important question is, what businesses have closed recently that maybe were doing something similar to what you're setting out to do? Depending on your concept, this may be an easier or harder question to answer. But there are a lot of resources that list, restaurant openings and closings, and I always find those really interesting. We definitely recommend meeting other business owners and learning about their business. And one thing that's really important is you cannot tell just by looking if a business is profitable. A busy restaurant does not mean a profitable restaurant. It can, but it doesn't necessarily. So that's something that we want to keep in mind. So in the process of defining our target audience, there are a couple of different activities that you can do to help you think this through. So we really want to consider a lot of different factors like demographics, preferences, maybe dietary restrictions, and the way that you are going to narrow your audience to the people who are really going to love what you do. And we write here, remember, you can't be everything to everyone. And so one activity that you can do is create customer personas. Has anyone here ever worked with customer personas before? Okay, a couple folks. I like to think of it as like a Pokemon card for your customer. So most businesses probably have a couple of different personas or like prototypes of customers who really love them. So a persona should include some demographic information like how old are they? Where do they live? How much money do they make? It also covers things that are not as concrete, like what are their values and their aspirations? What are their pain points? What is frustrating to them about the options that are already out there? And then we also think about how do you, as a business, fit into their life? What problem are you solving for them? So in this example, you might be able to see a couple lines. We have healthy Heather. We have her age, and we know that she is a millennial. And we've written down some traits, and we think that Heather is representative of a certain set of our customers. And based on this persona, we can start to identify, like, if we wanted to do some marketing campaigns, where do we think Heather is getting her marketing? Or if we wanted to create a new special to bring in more Heathers, what is Heather really into right now? What's a recipe she just discovered? And so on and so forth. Is this kind of making sense? Okay.
Just add,
Please.
there's customer personas is a pretty common business tool, so you can definitely look up templates online that will ask you key questions and help you get started into building your own.
Yeah. One thing I think that's really cool about personas is that you can have several for one business or for one product. And that allows you to account for the fact that, like, two people might love a restaurant for totally different reasons. And so it's not just that you only have one type of customer, but that you can segment them and understand what it is that they actually appreciate about the business and what motivates them to come spend their money at the business. So, for example, we were just working with a bakery that makes specialty egg-free vegan flour mixes. And of course, a lot of people like her product because they have allergies or they're serving people who have allergies. On the other hand, she has a lot of clients who are just really health conscious and want to eat, plant-based, whole foods. And so you might think those two groups are really similar, and they probably are in a lot of ways. But there are key differences around how you would find those people, what other products they're buying that you might want to model yourself after. And so being able to identify those differences, I think, is really important. We also certainly advise leveraging social media. So, building a following on one or two platforms. We, depending on your audience, typically recommend Instagram and TikTok. But at Maymay, at my business, if we need to reach like the boomer set, we are totally going to Facebook for that, right? So, another example of knowing your customer, knowing where they spend their time on the internet. And of course, social media doesn't just have to be, or marketing doesn't just have to be social media or Instagram. Email newsletters, I am a huge, huge fan of. Does anyone here get an email newsletter they like from a company? Maybe one or two. Okay. Does anyone mind sharing which newsletter you like? Clear Flower. Yeah, that's a great newsletter. What about you? Clover. Great.
I wasn't thinking of a food company.
Sure, that's okay.
New York Times.
Yeah, great. Okay, so thinking about what is it about the newsletter that you really like? And I actually have talked to the team at Clearflower about their newsletter because I think it's really good too. Their number one rule is you write it as if you're talking to one person, even though you're sending it to maybe thousands of people. So that's just one of the kind of tips or keys to writing a really compelling newsletter. And then, of course, surveys. A lot of people love to fill out surveys, and Instagram and TikTok have lots of options for you to collect feedback from folks. So that can be really valuable. And then, as we said before, testing your concept, starting small before you go big. The question really is, can you get people to pay for your product? Do they understand what it is? Do they have the willingness to pay? Are you in the right venue or the right neighborhood? A couple different ways to create demand and do this kind of testing is to do like a pop-up, like a temporary sales day, maybe at another restaurant. We also know that farmers markets are a great way for people to test concepts. And then finally, with your social media following, maybe you can get people to, place a custom order or purchase catering. So those are all ways of, starting out, testing the waters before you sign a big lease or take a big loan. When we're thinking about testing our concept, there's a lot of stuff that we want to consider. Of course, you probably are already an expert at making sure the product tastes really good. But there are other things that we want to incorporate and keep in mind, like presentation. How does it look? And also, if you're serving it in a takeout box, how does it look in the takeout box? There are a lot of dishes that look beautiful on a plate, but if you put it into, a plastic container, all of a sudden, it doesn't really have that perceived value. Portion size, cost effectiveness, replicability. If you're going to sell 100 plates of your famous chicken katsu, is the first one going to taste just like the last one? And how do you have to massage operations to account for that? Availability of ingredients. Are you going to be able to get all the ingredients you need? Cross-cultural marketing, this is a big one. We know a lot of folks who run pop-ups who are kind of presenting something that is part of their upbringing, their cultural background. And sometimes you have to really work hard to communicate a new product or something that's new to your guest. So how are you communicating across cultures? For example, at Maymay, we sell dumplings, and there are still some people in the world who have never had a dumpling. And so we have to be able to say, well, it's kind of like a ravioli, or it's kind of like an empanada, or, and so on and so forth. So what are the tools that we're using to make sure we're communicating what people are getting? And then finally, storage and transportation for pop-ups is always a little bit of a challenge. We're going to talk a little bit more about these logistics shortly. I wanted to present two sample pop-up menus. This is from Sekali, which is a Indonesian and Singaporean pop-up, and then one for Newbury Street, which is a coffee pop-up. And a couple things I'll point out here is that the first thing is these are really short menus, right? So doing a pop-up and having a really limited selection, we always recommend. There's also kind of a mix of different price points. So if you want to drop $21 on a barbecue platter, that's great. But if you're kind of just more looking for a snack, you can pay $7 for some curry puffs. And you'll notice also that that's a coffee menu, but for the food menu, we have a variety of different types of food. We have savory, we have sweet, we have some items that are in jars that you can take home with you. So it's not all just, a selection of hot curry dishes. It's a little bit of everything to give people some variety. All right, any questions before I keep going? Great. Okay, let's talk for a minute about food safety. So you have to make sure that you have undergone food safety training before you start feeding people. The CDC estimates that each year, roughly 48 million people get sick from a foodborne illness. Gross. We don't want to do that to anyone. And so there are a number of different certifications that you can get around food safety. The most common is ServSafe. Probably a couple people here have a ServSafe certification. So ServSafe is a training program basically designed to teach anyone who works with food how to prevent foodborne illness by managing storage practices, temperatures, and so on. I could go on a rant about ServSafe and the politics behind it, but suffice to say, this is an important thing for you to have. And any kitchen that you want to work in or do a pop-up in, any kitchen incubator, like food business incubator that you enter, is either going to provide this exam or ask you to have it before you come in. Just a couple notes about how foodborne illness is transmitted. Unfortunately, a lot of it has to do with poop, which is gross, but that is how a lot of foodborne illness actually gets around our food system, right? Contaminants in things that we either don't wash or we don't cook, and then people get sick. So a couple things that are really common in food businesses: improper food handling or hygiene practices, failure to cook or store food at safe temperatures, inadequate cleaning, or avoiding cross-contamination. All of these are things that we may like to think of as common sense. And the best way to make sure that it is common sense is for everybody to educate themselves, and in this case, to get a certification. Okay. Before we get into the financial reality check, does anyone have any other questions about this kind of initial chunk of content? Okay. Yeah, please.
Are there types of industries where you don't need, or types of food items that you don't need a ServSafe certification for, like ice cream or something?
Oh man, ice cream is a whole other thing. So what I would just say is, if you're working in a food business, you don't necessarily need to have a ServSafe certificate in this state. For you to own a business or be the manager of it, those are typically required. So it's attached to your permit. It's not so much related to the type of food you're making. But if you're thinking about ice cream has a bunch of its own additional regulations. So watch out for that. Yeah. Great. Is it your turn, Carla?
Let's do it.
Okay. Fun time with Carla.
We'll see about that.
All right. So, like we discussed, one of the things that you're probably great at is making your food taste good. But profitability is really important. You want a business that makes money. And so it's really important to make sure that your menu is priced correctly based on the ingredients that you use, the cost of labor. For example, in a city like Boston, our labor is a lot more expensive than some of the towns on the outside, and the current market. So it's time for some audience participation. If you sell a $12 sandwich, how much do you think you should be spending on ingredients?
You can hold up a number of fingers.
Yes. Love some guesses. We have $4 over there. Any other takers? 2? 2 also? 3? Okay. Any other guesses? Anybody going a lot higher or a lot lower? So we got 2 to 4 so far. Sound about right? Okay. So before we answer that question, how do we figure that out? So in some industries, cost of goods factors in labor and product costs. In restaurants, because those are our two most variable expenses, we treat them separately actually. So cost of goods in a food business is all of the expenses that are directly associated with the ingredients and the packaging that goes to food sold. So the example I always give is you can't put a scoop of ice cream in your customer's hand. The cup or the cone would be part of your COGS. And our COGS help us decide how to price our dishes. Typically, your sale price will be 3 to 5 times your COGS. And it's really important to think about COGS in dollars and percentages. And so I'll get to that. But with the 3 to 5 range, that $12 sandwich means we have a budget of $2.40 up to $4 to spend on ingredients. So great job, everyone.
Yeah.
So we have some pretty standardized benchmarks for food service businesses and a unified standard of what should be spent on each business category. So the whole pie is your revenue. So all of the sales that you make, all of the money that comes in. Your COGS can range between 20 and 35%. This is a great one to take a picture of. But the most important thing is actually the relationship between your COGS and your labor. Depending on the concept that you have, whether you're running a scratch bakery or you're buying your products pre-made, this mix of your labor versus your ingredients can look very different. But on the whole, the one thing I want you to remember is that your COGS and your direct labor together should never exceed 60% of your revenue. And that holds pretty true across all kinds of business models, from casual places to fine dining. This is kind of the gold standard of where you need to be for a healthy food business to operate. And then that gives us about 30% for our overheads. That's going to be literally everything else that is not your food and is not your direct labor. And direct labor is going to be the hands-on work in preparing the food, not your HR person or legal, just the people that are making the food. Those jobs will actually go in overheads. And then theoretically, that leaves you 10% for profit. Like Irene said, just because it's a benchmark or it's the standard doesn't mean it's reality. Like she mentioned, the average profit for a food business pre and post COVID, this number actually hasn't changed very much, is between 3 and 5% nationally. And so I mentioned that your COGS can vary by concept. So here we have a bakery that's all scratch. So in a business like that, what are your most expensive ingredients? You're buying maybe some butter, some fancy chocolate, and flour. You're probably also going to have people working in your facility about 18 hours a day. So your labor costs are going to be really high compared to your ingredient costs. Now, we can compare that to a cafe that maybe specializes in coffee and they source their pastries from this bakery that we just talked about. They're going to pay a little bit more on their ingredient costs, so their COGS are higher, but the employees aren't doing all the heavy baking. They're just taking something out of a package, putting it on a plate, serving it to a customer. So you don't need as many human beings to do that kind of work. And so this would be an example of two very healthy businesses that have a different COGS to direct labor relationship, but still within that 60%. Any questions about this? So some other statistics or benchmarks to think about. In general, your rent should not exceed 8% of your revenue. This is really important. Your rent is something that's pretty much always going to go up and not down. And so making sure that you can afford your lease or any space that you get into upfront is extremely important. We see people that do a lot of things right, but have bought into a lease that they really can't afford. And it just is such an uphill battle to climb out from under that. There's very little that you can do or change other than physically move to change your rent. And on average, the food service rate for worker hourly rate is $18 an hour in the greater Boston area. It depends on where you specialize, but this is a good rule. But you also need to factor payroll costs, employment taxes, and these things are called fringe. And so even though the employee receives $18 an hour, they actually get less than that after taxes. You are also being taxed on your end as the employer. And so in Massachusetts, we calculate fringe at about 15%. And so each labor hour for you as an employer actually costs you $20.70. And each year this changes a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about how these numbers become relevant as you create a financial plan for your business. We're going to keep it super high level. When you fund your business, you have to keep in mind that you're going to need to have budget and funding for your startup costs, ramp up time. There's going to be some slow sales months. The food business in general is very cyclical. January, February tend to be extremely slow. Sometimes there's a little summer slump. And then September through December, it's kind of a race to the holidays. People make the majority of their money then. Although with the election this past year, a lot of our clients actually saw that being a slower period than they expected. So you need to plan ahead for even the unforeseen. There might be delays with permits. We see this all the time, especially in Boston. You're kind of at the mercy of all these different departments that may or may not be working together and in your favor. And so things that you thought would take a couple months, double or triple in timeline. And you need to factor in your own salary. Very often, entrepreneurs do not think about paying themselves. And it's a hobby if you're not actually making money for yourself, if you can't sustain your own family, your own needs. And so another really important thing to consider is people are like, oh, well, I'll get a loan. I have great credit. Most lenders, in order for you to secure a business loan, want to see at least a year's worth of proof that you're a real business. So some sales data, other information like that before you're even eligible for a loan. So a lot of these initial startup costs are mostly relying on your personal savings to get you off the ground. And speaking of that, Irene, can you tell us a little bit more about the costs and timelines of Mayway?
Yes. So I wanted to give two real world examples. I think we have someone in the waiting room. Of the two build outs that I personally have overseen as a food business owner. So the take home here is that it always takes longer and it always costs more than what you think or hope. So in 2013, we took on a build out near Kenmore Square, and it was about 1,500 square feet. We looked for almost half a year, a little over half a year for the location, and it took us 2 months to negotiate the lease with the landlord. I will also say we did not do a very good job doing due diligence on the landlord, and we ended up being very unhappy with her. She actually still owes us $10,000. So all of that is to say we probably could have negotiated for longer, but we were in a position where we felt a little bit desperate. We had to, grow the business beyond the food truck. We thought that the build out was going to take us like 3 months, and it ended up taking 9. We thought it was going to cost about $130,000, and it ended up costing almost $200,000. Yeah, please.
Were you paying rent the entire 9 months that you were?
Great question. So typically a landlord, the question was, were we paying rent the whole time? Typically a landlord will give you a rent forgiveness period. 1 to 3 months, I think, is what I see most often. But yeah, it really hurts when the rent kicks in, you're still paying for the build out, and you're not bringing in any revenue. So planning for that is critical. One other thing I would just add in terms of, getting help from your landlord, tenant improvement money. So this is often called TI if you're looking at a lease negotiation. This is money that the landlord is willing to give you to spruce up the space, to spend on making it a nicer space. It adds value for them as the landlord. But as you can see, in this situation, we got none of it. A couple other things. We attorney who didn't really specialize in commercial lease negotiations. And, maybe all about attorneys, but you can't just have Uncle Bobby, who's a divorce lawyer, do your lease negotiation for you. Attorneys and the legal profession is highly specialized, right? And so you want someone who knows exactly what you need them to do. And we also had a lot of conflict with our landlord of our contractor. We got bids from a number of different contractors, and we couldn't afford the higher ones. And so we got what we paid for with this, relatively minimal budget. So compare this to about 10 years later when we took on a much bigger build out, huge space, longer search, longer negotiation, a ton of tenant improvement because the landlord really wanted us there, but also overall a $2.4 million build out. It took over a year to get the full build out done. And I think that it was only 14 months because we hired a dedicated project manager with experience to move all of the permits forward, all of the processes forward. So this is just a couple data points about what it takes to get a lease and to get a space up and running. But hopefully this is helpful or at least interesting. Cool. Okay, back to you, Carla.
And we forge ahead.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's kind of zooming all the way out, assuming several years down the line. But from where you are today, how can you even begin to estimate your business's potential? So a financial forecast is going to give you an idea of what it'll take to fund your business and create startup costs. This is a great exercise at multiple stages of your business, just to kind of wrap your head around the real numbers that it'll take to get off and running. So financial forecasts are used in several ways for you to plan ahead, as a management tool once your business is up and running. Again, those people that are really successful are really in tune with their numbers. They're constantly keeping up with their financials. Planning ahead is a big piece of that. And it also allows you to communicate your viability of your concept to banks, to investors, to your landlord. All of these people are going to want to see financial projections from you. And so where did these numbers come from? Past performance is a big piece of it. Again, those pop-ups, finding opportunities to start truly market testing your product, and that means getting people to buy it, will tell you what people are willing to pay. Making educated estimates of revenues and expenses. Again, doing your research, where you plan to open the business so you have a true understanding of the costs, as well as demographic and statistical information. This is available through your local library, census websites. You can get really detailed information about the people that live in the neighborhood or area where you expect to open a business, as well as those industry benchmarks that we talked about. And so when you build out a financial forecast, this is one for a year. It looks kind of gnarly and scary like this. But for the purposes of today, we're just going to work on creating a simple 5-line profit and loss statement, which will be the beginning of a forecast. And so we're going to sketch this out together. So we're going to estimate the revenue for Dylan's Diner. It is going to be a counter service restaurant, and it specializes in smash burgers. Nothing crazy. So the average order that we expect people to make, because again, we're super specialized, our menu is nice and small. We have our signature smash burger that's $12. People will probably order a side of fries for $4 and have a drink for $2. So we can just take a very educated guess that the average order price will be around $18. And so you'll plug in the numbers for your most popular dish or setup that you expect to sell in your business. And so based on my demographic research that I've done, I can estimate that I'm going to have 120 guests per day, also based on my seating. I plan to be open 6 days a week, and I plan to be open 50 weeks a year. Please don't ever put 52 weeks a year in your financial projections. There are holidays and something will break. It's a restaurant. The plumbing, the electricity, the AC, there will be forced closures at some time. It's better to just plan ahead. And also, if you ever wanted to take a vacation, you should budget that in now. Really important. And so how do we calculate revenue with this information? We took our average order price. We multiplied it by our average guests per day, the number of days per week we plan to be open times the number of weeks we plan to be open per year. And so our average annual revenue is $648,000 for this business. Again, super high level, grounded in just some research and educated guesses, but at least it's a starting point. It gives us an idea of what it's going to take to get going. And so that gives us a monthly revenue of $54,000. And so how can we use even this super basic profit and loss statement to budget for major expenses? We'll use the market research that we did and the industry benchmarks that we talked about earlier. So revenue is always, because it's all your sales coming in, is always 100% of itself. And in this case, we're going to estimate a COGS budget of 25%. And like I mentioned, your labor and your COGS always add up to 60%. And so if I spent 25% on COGS, that gives me a budget of 35% of my revenue for direct labor. Again, in a city like Boston, where your labor is going to be more expensive, it is going to be on the higher side, that 35%. Sometimes you'll see the split 30-30. In Boston, it's just not realistic for most businesses. And then that 30% that we said was set aside for our overheads. So now we came from this really high level number, and we have a little bit of a budget for each of the core areas of the business. And we're estimating about 10% profit. You have to plan to succeed, otherwise it doesn't work out that way. So this gives us a starting point. And so what can we do with even these basic numbers? It can help us make some really important decisions. We can look at this and decide if we can afford the following. Maybe I'm shopping around for a lease, a little spot where I want to open up my bakery or my cafe, and the lease is $5,000 a month for rent. So about $60,000 a year. Can I afford that? We're about to find out. And maybe I want to hire some employees, and I'm thinking 8 people is what it takes for me to keep the operations running so I can have a day off. And it's going to cost me $18 an hour on average for those employees. With this budget, can I afford 8 people? So, first thing, if we go back to some of those extra statistics, we talked about rent being no more than 8% of your annual revenue. So, since we have an estimated revenue number, we take 8% from that, and that means I have a budget of $51,840 annually for my rent. So that would be a no on that $60,000 lease. Either I need to figure out how I'm going to make up that gap, but I'm going to be chasing that revenue, or I should be looking at a more affordable place. And so how about those staff members that we wanted to hire? 8 full-time people at $18 an hour. This one takes a little bit more math. We need to figure out how many hours of labor we can first afford with our direct labor budget of $226,800 for the year. So we took that budget, stuck it at the top, and we're dividing it by our average hourly labor cost. And so even though we're expecting to pay people $18 an hour, we can't forget about fringe because that's what it costs us as a business. So it's that $20.70. And so that means I have 10,956, I wish these were rounder numbers, of labor hours for the whole year. I'm going to be open 50 weeks a year like we talked about. So that gives me 219 hours of labor per week. And let's say I'm hiring everybody full-time, like I mentioned, I can actually only afford 5.47 employees. So that's probably 5 full-time people and 1 part-time person. And we need to think about if that includes like my labor as the owner, if I'm doing direct labor all the time. And so again, this example is just to show you how very little financial information can actually help you make some really big decisions. Because like I said, it's often people getting into leases that they can't afford. That's like the first pitfall or one of the first ones. And it's a really hard trap to get out of. And so keep in mind that when you are ready to pursue a loan or other financial support, most lenders will want to see 3 to 5 years of detailed projections, kind of the scarier one that I showed you, broken down month by month. They want to see ramp up time. They're going to want to see seasonality. They're going to want to make sure that you actually understand your business. So if it's the same thing copied over 12 times over, it's just not going to fly. And these benchmarks are really for goal setting only. We're planning for 10% profit. Like I said, nationally, the average is 3 to 5%, and it takes 2 to 3 years to be profitable in the first place. These are all the things that you need to account for before you make that financial commitment. Any questions? Cool. Irene, back to you.
Terrifying. Great job, Carla. Also, I do want to say that if you go through some of these exercises to build projections, you will already have done way more than I did before starting my food business, and way more than probably many food business startups. So you can put yourself ahead of the game. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the kind of brass tacks to get started, if we haven't scared you away from this potential journey. So the first thing we'll talk about is entity formation. Has anyone here ever created an entity, a corporation, an LLC, anything like that? Okay, great. So forming a legal entity is basically going to the state and saying, I am officially starting a business. You have to choose a specific structure, like a corporation or an LLC. And the reason to do that is that it protects you from risks to the business, also pulling in your personal finances. So this is, you may not be able to see this, but basically these are the different kinds of business structures that you can have. Most food businesses are LLCs, limited liability companies. If you do not form an entity, the government is going to treat you as a sole proprietorship. That's like your default. The problem with a sole proprietorship is that there's unlimited personal liability. So heaven forbid someone gets sick, someone slips and falls. There is no company to protect your personal finances and assets from that risk. So like the default is very high risk, which is why if you're thinking about pursuing this direction, we definitely would want you to go ahead and form an entity. So there are a bunch of resources for this out there. We'll share some at the end of this session. But to legally form your business, you have to choose a business structure. That includes certain tax implications, the way that you'll do your taxes at the end of the year. You have to get an employer identification number from the IRS, which is kind of like the social security number for your business. You'll register your business with Mass Tax to make sure that you're paying all of the payroll taxes as well as meals taxes that you are going to collect. You have to file with the Secretary of the Commonwealth, which is about $500 a year. And then finally, you can get a business certificate from your city or town. A lot of farmers markets or commercial kitchens that you might try to work out of will require some or all of these things. Some of them will be able to help you with them, but ultimately these tend to be required. And as I said, there are tax obligations. So of course, you do your taxes at the end of the year, but when you run a business, there are a bunch of other taxes that you have to be thinking about. So corporate excise tax is a tax on basically the property that you own. There are a bunch of different taxes that come with having employees. And then I do want to point out sales and meals tax. So here in the city of Boston, everybody pays 7% on top of their check at a restaurant, and that gets paid out to the city and the state. The crazy thing is, when you open a restaurant, you will never receive a letter from the state saying, hey, just so you know, you got to collect taxes and you got to pay them to us. They will never tell you. So it is your job to collect those taxes, do the math, tell the state what you owe them, and then pay them what you owe them. If you get into debt on sales and meals tax, it will follow you even if you close the business and or declare bankruptcy. So this is really, really important. And there are businesses out there that were really successful and did not pay their meals tax properly. And that is enough to put you out of business because it does incur interest and it follows you. So hopefully I've scared you enough for you to remember that. If you are thinking about selling a packaged product, you may not need to pay meals and sales taxes on that, but that's something that we would want you to do more diligence on. Yeah.
The meals tax is separate from the tax that the client side pays.
So the customer pays the meals tax, the business collects it, and then has to pay it to the state. And so you can imagine, like, if you forget to pay it to the state or you don't know that you have to pay it, you might be collecting it hand over fist and like, wow, we're making so much money. But if that bill comes due all at once, that can be pretty ruinous. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions about that? Great. So the next thing we want to think about is business insurance. So we've got a guy, we really like him. We'll give you his name at the end of the session. A lot of different kinds of insurance that a business needs. This is just a selection of them. Most businesses do need general liability. And if you are going to have employees, you need workers' compensation insurance as well. And if you are going to go to a farmer's market or do a pop-up, they may ask you for a COI, which stands for Certificate of Insurance. You just email your broker, ask them for a copy, and they'll get it to you. And the guy we use, Matt, we love him. He is really, really fast, which is great. Okay. And then we wanted to talk about, if you've gone through all of these processes, you are ready to start up, what needs to happen for you to actually get that business open? So finalizing a business plan is the first step. Actually, we're going to go through each of these in turn, but this is the overview. Take your photos. Yeah, I'll pose. Okay, great. So in terms of the business plan, we are happy to provide a business plan outline to anybody who is interested in it. It should contain key information like your concept, your target market, the menu, and of course, like we talked about, those financial projections. There are also a ton of like sample business plans out there that you can look at. And there's one that is linked here, and we'll email this out, that was created by Graffito, which is a brokerage that helps place restaurant tenants with commercial landlords. And so that's a pretty good resource. Next, securing funding. As we talked about, how much cash cushion are you going to need to take this over the finish line to the point where you can actually generate revenue? Your projections should help you figure this out. And you definitely want to be thinking about the build out, the startup costs, and that cash cushion. What happens if you were hoping to open in August and then you open in the dead of winter in February? How much cash are you going to need in the bank in order to survive those initial hurdles? And when we're thinking about funding, we definitely have some opinions about where to consider borrowing money. So community banks or community financial institutions can be a great resource. There's also crowdfunding, so using different platforms to collect money from your community to help you start up. In many cases, folks can have investors and or friends and family. Friends and family are the most common type of investors in food businesses. We also have seen a lot of people use funding sources that can really damage their credit or their personal financial situations. So we highly recommend against taking a loan with a high interest rate, a high APR, as well as personal loans and using personal credit cards. Again, the point of having a business, of having a legal entity, is to protect you, your personal finances, your family, your mortgage, what have you, from whatever happens in the business. And so we want to be really careful about that. Finding a location, again, developing your budget for your rent and trying to decide, what can I afford based on how much I think I can sell. You can work with a broker. Excuse me. Thank you. You can work with a broker who will help you find a location. There are also a ton of resources online like LoopNet or other kind of marketplaces where you can just look at leases that happen to be out there. Most commercial leases, just for everyone's info, include triple net, which is all of the costs related to taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. So maybe like maintaining the parking lot, for example. And that's typically called CAM. And then generally for a lease term, you're going to be looking at signing for something like 5 or 10 years with some options to renew. That's sort of standard. There are some incubator spaces that we'll mention later that offer shorter lease terms. But whatever you're thinking about doing, hopefully you feel confident in doing it for 5 years. But that can be a big commitment. As I said before, consider working with a broker. Weigh the pros and cons of building out a space from scratch versus getting a turnkey space. Turnkey meaning like it's basically ready to go. So maybe you want to open a bakery, you find a former bakery, and it has most of what you need in it. There are pros and cons to that, right? You have to deal with the old equipment, the way they had it set up. But on the other hand, you probably aren't shelling out as much money for the build out in the first place. A lot of times restaurants get built in buildings that had nothing to do with a restaurant in them beforehand. So like Maymay 2.0 was an office, and that certainly contributed to the cost. Again, we want to warn folks that it can take a year or more to go from finding a space to actually being open and getting that revenue in. So thinking about what are the bills I have to pay in the meantime? When is rent going to kick in? Those are all critical. And then, you should always be talking to contractors, but making sure that you have a lease signed before you do a formal engagement with a contractor to build out your space. Any questions about this? Okay. Woo! Permitting. So there are a lot of permits required to run a food business in the state of Massachusetts and in the city of Boston. One of the big challenges is that you often have to get these in a very specific order. So if you can't get your building permit, you can't get your occupancy permit, and then you can't get your health and so on and so forth. So that's part of why permitting can really hold things up. These are a number of the permits that are required. We borrowed this slide from a Cambridge-specific presentation, so that's why it says Cambridge here. But making sure that you know exactly what permits are required is something that we recommend working with the city or town where you're operating. There are other permits that might be required, including things like a farmer's market, if you're going to be selling wholesale, if you'll be doing catering, milk permit for our ice cream startups. There are a number of very specific permits that may or may not be required in different places. And I'll just share a caveat in case anyone here is thinking about food trucks. A huge challenge for a food truck is that you need a totally different set of permits for every city that you operate in. So just because you're all good to go in the city of Boston doesn't mean you're good to go in Cambridge. And there might even be new permits that you've never heard of that you have to get if you want to be a mobile business. So that face that you're making is exactly why we don't have a food truck anymore, because it was so challenging. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit about finalizing your menu. We talked a little about menu design. Shorter is better. That's really the point I want to make. But of course, you want to make sure you're aligning with your concept, your target market. Who are these people? What do they really want? And use data from the experimentation and testing that you've done. At some point, you're going to need to hire staff. So a critical piece of this is finding a payroll provider, someone who can help you pay all the appropriate taxes. We recommend Gusto. A lot of people use other platforms. And we know that early on, you may have like friends or family who help you, and you may pay them in cash or under the table. And that is part of life. And the sooner you can stop doing that, the better. But we know that that is how a lot of businesses get their start. Of course, we also want to finalize a company handbook and make sure that everything is compliant. Just because nobody told you that you have to follow rules as an employer doesn't mean you don't have to follow them. There are a lot of pitfalls that we see where operators are doing their best, but no one's ever trained them on how to be a compliant employer. So things like making sure people get earned sick time, making sure you're following overtime laws. Overtime laws. These are things that the state is not going to tell you about in advance, but if they find out you're breaking the law, they will come for you. So that's a really tough balance, and you have to be proactive about it. And then finally, hiring and training your staff, creating standard operating procedures so that they know what their job is, and making sure that you're paying them for that training time. So that's another expense to budget for, especially if you make a highly specialized product, like maybe you make croissants and nobody knows how to laminate dough, or maybe you do a special cuisine that people haven't cooked before. Budgeting that into your startup plan is super important. Marketing, we talked about this a little bit, but making sure your website is live and you have hours of operation, having your Google listing, maybe a Yelp listing as well, and having some kind of marketing plan to promote your business. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars on it. You don't have to post on social media every single day, but consistency is really important, and making sure that if people want to find you, they can find you on the internet is critical. All right, we talked about insurance. We have a referral that we'll provide for you. We don't get any kickback from him, but we probably should because we recommend him all the time, my friend Matt. Okay. Next is establishing vendor relationships. So where am I going to get my product? You should know based on your menu what kind of ingredients you're going to need, and you can use that list to ask for pricing from different vendors. A lot of early stage businesses use Restaurant Depot primarily, which is kind of like a Costco, cash and carry. So you go there, you pick out the stuff you want, they check you out, you pay with cash or a credit card or what have you. But of course, there are also distributors that will provide you with a catalog and deliver the food to you. You've probably gotten trapped behind one of their trucks on Boylston Street before and been like, what are you doing here? So there are also those kinds of options. A lot of vendors have delivery minimums or other rules. And so when you're shopping around, we definitely recommend getting a couple of different quotes for the products you want, and also making sure you understand any other logistical requirements. And then finally, purchasing major equipment and supplies. Often people do a mix of used equipment and new equipment. And we certainly recommend working with your contractor or another service provider to help you get the right equipment. I could talk a lot more about equipment, but I won't for right now. Okay. Developing a facilities management plan. So if you are in a brand new building and it's a new lease, making sure you understand the requirements for stuff like snow removal, pest control, landscaping, general maintenance. Your relationship with your landlord is really important. And so being on top of this in advance is critical. Develop a waste management plan. So, is there room for a dumpster? Can I have compost? How am I going to recycle? Making sure that all of that is arranged before you actually get into the space and need to have those services is something that you can do during that period where you're waiting for permits or waiting for construction to finish. Okay, revisit your financial projections. I love to make projections and then stow them away and never look at them again because of how out of touch I was before. But there's a lot of value to actually comparing your projections to how things are going. And so this is a muscle that we really recommend exercising. So, I had a guess as to how many staff I would hire and how much it would cost to pay them. But what did it actually cost? Comparing those numbers is that kind of exercise we're talking about. Making sure you know your initial inventory needs. So, if you're going to have a big menu, you have to buy all of that product before anyone walks in the door. So, will you have the cash flow for that? And then finally, getting ready for opening day, conducting final inspections, training staff. Inevitably, things go wrong. So having a friends and family event is a great way to kind of test drive all of your operations. And I cannot emphasize this enough. Consider limiting your hours in the first few months of operation. You are going to be exhausted. People love when you expand your hours, but it's harder to take those hours away, right? Once you've created an expectation. I worked with a client today she's open 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. We had a talk and I said, in 2 weeks, you're going to regret this. And I'm just telling you now that I'm going to tell you later that I told you so. And that's what I told her today. So she adjusted her hours to 12 to 8 p.m. And I am so happy for her. And I'm happy for me because I was right. But again, your energy as the business owner, your energy and your time is the most valuable thing. And so if you have to spend it on doing things other than bringing in revenue, it better be worth it. So that is bringing us towards the end of our presentation tonight. I wanted to show a number of resources. This is a good slide to take a picture of too. If you are asking yourself a question like, how can I get support or like have an entrepreneurship boot camp? What kitchen can I start R&Ding my product at? Where can I get some culinary training? Where can I find a lawyer or an insurance broker? These are the resources that we would put forth to all of you. And we have pretty extensive experience with all of these organizations. Happy to answer questions about any of these if folks have them. But for now, he's got it. Okay, good. It's just an Easter egg for later. A couple other things we would consider, we would present to you in terms of your next steps. So this is a suggested action plan. You have come out here in this heat. You've sat through this presentation. What are you going to do with everything you've learned? So we would recommend spending the next couple of weeks thinking more about your product and your target market, maybe even doing some math around the costs to produce your offerings, and then thinking about the permitting requirements for the sales channels that you're interested in. In the next couple of months, developing your minimum viable product and testing it with potential customers, maybe, scheduling a first pop-up, create some basic financial projections, and of course, make sure that you have all of the permits, certifications, basically cover your butt before you get started. And then in the medium term, try and sell some stuff. See how it goes. Do people like it? Do you like doing it? These are all important questions. Get that really important customer feedback and then think about, okay, if I want to do this for real, how much money am I going to need and where am I going to get it? So these are some questions for your consideration, and we invite folks on Zoom to join in if they'd like. Do you feel ready to move forward? What have you learned about maybe strengths or weaknesses? What do you know now that you don't know before? Is this going to be a hobby, or are you going all in with both feet? Or what other information can we provide to you for your next step? So I'll pause there. Anyone want to jump in? Right here, yeah.
I guess I have more of like a question for you.
Yeah.
About how would you tailor this advice for someone who wants to get into more of a packaged food situation versus a restaurant?
Great question. So the question was for a CPG product, a consumer packaged good. Most of the advice is the same. And I would say that the farmer's market and pop-up route is still going to be one of the most viable kind of low barrier to entry ways to get going. And I would also recommend pretty much all of these same resources as well, except for maybe the Cambridge Food Business Basics program. That's our program, but it's aimed more at food service. I think one thing that I would encourage that we didn't talk about is considering how you want to sell your product. If you want it to be, on the shelves at every Whole Foods, what does that mean for the cost? How big a cut does a supermarket need? And we could share some additional information about that if you want to get in touch with us. We'll have our email address up on the next slide. Yeah, we'll go over here and then back to you. Thanks.
Yeah, what are the typical lease terms when it comes to some of these community kitchens?
Great question. The question was, what are the lease terms for these community kitchens? My understanding is that most of them are month to month, and they may include, if you go through one of their programs, it may include some hours in the kitchen. But often they do bill by usage, essentially. So I think at Commonwealth Kitchen, your membership comes with 10 hours a month, and then for every additional hour, there's an additional fee. You pay for storage. So these things add up fast. And that's part of why, we moved away from the food truck into our own restaurant so quickly back in 2013. I would just add that Nibble Kitchen offers a 1-year residency as for the winners of their pitch competition. So they have like an entrepreneurship workshop series, then they do a pitch competition, and then people get a 1-year residency part-time. So like a couple days a week. And that's in Bow Market in Somerville. If you've been over there, you may have noticed the Nibble Kitchen booth has different businesses there on different days of the week. Yeah. Yeah, back to you.
So if we don't want to go into a commercial kitchen but do it from home, is that possible? Or
so for the most part, it is not possible. And for all the reasons we talked about, the only things that are allowable under cottage food laws are baked goods with no fun stuff in them. So like very little dairy, very little, like anything basically that would be shelf stable. But like you can't do salad dressings, you can't do pickles, you definitely can't do juice, because juice has a lot of like enzymatic, there's a lot of rules about juice. The good news is most of these commercial kitchens have experience with these different types of companies. So they may have, huge equipment that you could never afford as a startup, but maybe it could help you get to the next step. But unfortunately, the laws really don't permit for most items to be made out of a home kitchen. Yeah.
Do you ever see kitchen sharing with like an existing restaurant? Like maybe they're not open on certain days.
Yep.
So could you speak to that at all?
Absolutely. So like a part-time kind of kitchen residency during off hours. Yeah. We see this not all the time, but sometimes. It's hard to share space. It's kind of like, when you leave for work in the morning, if someone else came and lived in your house and like slept in your bed, like that's kind of what it's like. But what we would say is if you wanted to approach an existing restaurant, maybe they're closed 2 days a week, like, hey, could I come in and use the space? I would come with like a proposal, something kind of concrete. It doesn't have to be, a million pages, but show that you've thought through all of these different issues, that you know what your responsibilities should be. And we would also recommend spending some time in the restaurant during operating hours. So offering to shadow, the dinner shift so that you can see how they like to close, or like working a shift in the dish pit so that you know how all of those systems work. Those are the kinds of things that help build your credibility with that organization. And, what you really don't want is like an us versus them mentality where like, the old trope of like, whoever opened like totally messed this up, and the opener's like, whoever closed was such a jerk, and it's like, okay guys, like same old story. So you want to avoid that. So building that rapport and relationship and really articulating who's responsible for what, I think is important. But certainly on a short or medium term basis, I think it's a great idea.
And to Irene's point, relationships are key here. If you already work in the business or have a relationship with the team and the owner, you actually know the operations, you know how they like to close, you have a much higher likelihood of finding an arrangement like that. But it's sort of like a closed club. I think somebody that doesn't have experience, it's going to be probably close to impossible to find an arrangement like that, because the liability is actually pretty high for the business that's taking you on. And so they already need to have quite a great deal of trust in you, that you're not going to make anybody sick or screw anything up while you're there. So if you're already in the industry, you probably have a sense of if that's possible or not.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Now we have a question online.
Ooh.
For a cafe pop-up, what permit or license might we need to resell a food product from another vendor?
Okay, for a cafe pop-up, what product or license might we need to resell a food product from another vendor? You, depending on the venue, if, for example, this were at a farmer's market, you would need a health permit. And typically, a health permit means that you have a commercial kitchen that you're calling your home. So you would have to have some kind of relationship with a commercial kitchen. It could be another restaurant. It could be one of these shared kitchen spaces that we talked about. In terms of reselling, in most cases, people don't care too much about like whether they've formally sold it to you under a wholesale license. But ideally, they would have a wholesale license and be selling it to you legally and appropriately. If you were doing a pop-up in some like third-party facility, I don't know, at the library, never mind. At some other place, I think you can probably get away without permitting, but I wouldn't recommend it. And of course, for special events or like one-time events, typically the organizers have to reach out to the city health department. And then if the health department knows that you're going to be there, they're going to come and inspect you. And they're going to want to see your ServSafe certification, your health permit, and so on. So it's basically the same as another vending opportunity, I would say. And happy to answer a more specific question if that didn't cover it for the guest on Zoom. How do we feel? Anything else? We have a couple more minutes if folks have other questions. Okay.
You said you recommended Gusto for payroll?
Yeah.
Could I ask why?
Yeah, it's like payroll for millennials instead of boomers, I think. It's and like they're helpful for the most part. I don't know. What would you say? Yeah.
Things like Paychecks or ADP, which is sort of these monster legacy softwares that are like for corporations. This is kind of the right size for even a large restaurant or a chain of restaurants or a small hospitality group.
Yeah. And the price is, I think, pretty fair relative to how easy it is to use. Yeah.
But there are other options.
Awesome.
We had another question in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
If we created an LLC in one state for pop-ups but decided to sell in another, tax do we charge?
Ooh, great question. If we create an LLC in one state and sold products in another, whose meals tax do we pay? You know, I think technically you would pay meals tax in the state where the sale is made. With the caveat that if you're, depending on how you're selling it, if it's a packaged product, you wouldn't incur meals tax for that. But let me see what else I can find out, and I'm happy to get back to this person. Certainly, you know, if you're a food truck and you do like festivals all over the Northeast, like you run into that kind of issue. So we can get more details on that. And often the government doesn't care where your corporation is based, but the health department cares where your kitchen is located. And then I think the Department of Revenue cares where you made the sale. So there's so many intersections with government. And as we know, government can be challenging, even with just one node of connection. So we can find out more about that. Great. We're going to hang out. We have a little survey. We would love to hear if we were helpful or just scary. You can scan this with your phone or go to that URL. Takes 2 minutes and helps us offer an even better, hopefully, opportunity to folks in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.